All right, sure. Good day, good day. Welcome back. This is me, Dr. Singema Vima, and I'm here today with another video in our series. Now, this is a video that I've done previously, but upon second watch and upon some feedback, there were a couple of things that I did not get to as I would have wanted to that first time around. So I'm giving it a do-over, if you will, and and our topic focuses particularly on the Scramble for Africa, the Scramble for Africa. And the song I played just now was a more somber song for two reasons. Uh, the song is called "If I Was," and from the context it would finish off "If I Was Shona," which is the larger, the colloquial name for the larger ethnic group in Zimbabwe, out of which I belong. And the artist was performing this was the Ndebele artist, which is the second biggest group, and there's been historical schisms that I can talk about at a different time between the two groups. So it's somber because I think it ties into the topic we're talking about today, which is the Scramble for Africa, the way in which the country was partitioned. I mean, the different parts of the continent were partitioned by the European colonialists, and now that continues to haunt us in its various legacies. That's one. But also, it is also somber because the artist who wrote and sang the song, Calvin, just passed away last night. Young hip hop artist, age 35 years old, out of Zimbabwe. And it's as wild as 2020 has been for communities around the world. I can speak with some authority to the losses encountered in Zimbabwe, and they've been pretty drastic as well. So Calvin, man, thank you so much for sharing your talents with us when you were here. Rest in peace, and we prayers up for your family and your loved ones that you've left behind. That's one. The second thing I want to talk about real quick is I want to mention Nigeria today. If you've been paying attention to the news in the past couple of weeks actually, and if you've had your ear to the ground, you know this has been happening for a few years. But with the idea of police violence and things like that, particularly in what was the SARS, which was the Special Anti-Robbery. I forget the second S, but it's SARS. That's what what the acronym is, and that's what a lot of people are calling to an end to under the hashtag end SARS. But that was dismantled, but immediately rebranded as SWAT, which was a very similar organization. And in fact, the most recent killings that have happened from the police on innocent peaceful protesters was after the SARS had apparently been dismantled, if you will. So, our luta continua, and our prayers and our voices up for Nigeria in this moment. And I could go on all day about that, but we have to do this work. So, like I said, this is part of the Intro to African History series. It's a re-upload of the Scramble for Africa video I've done in the past. So without further ado, let me get right into the material and share my screen with you as I do. Okay, we go here. All right, and just like that, we are cooking with gas. I will see you guys at the end. So, typically, when we talk about African history, it is momentous. A lot of things are momentous, and they're very momentous to me as a scholar of African history, as a passionate African. I'll quote Kwame Nkrumah when he says, "I'm African not because I was born in Africa. I am African because Africa was born in me." So, when I say that, A lot of things are momentous in Africa. However, objectively speaking, the Scramble for Africa, which again was done with zero African agency, and you'll see what I mean by that as we go forward, is one of the most defining moments in the history of not just Africa, but in the history of the world, particularly in the history of the modern world, and you'll see why. So we can talk about when the rise of social media, we can talk about when 9/11 happened, we can talk about this and that. But when you talk about moments in which the world changed, if you talk about those moments, and we'll even talk about this here, right? We can talk about Corona as being a very particularly zeitgeist shifting moment, if you will. So when you do all that, it is also important that we put the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which initiated what is known as the Scramble for Africa, and a lot of times it's spoken about as being synonymous with the Scramble itself, as one of the things that fundamentally changed everything as we know it. Let's get going. So, what was happening in Europe at the time, right? And we'll talk about Africa as well. So don't this is an African history session, but I think it's one of those where the worlds collide, and it's important that we talk about what was happening on either side. So, what was happening in Europe at the time? What is it that precipitated, if you will, the Berlin Conference? So, it is important to know some critical changing factors in Europe. First of all, beginning in the late 18th century and for the large part in the first half a century of the 19th century, up to 1800s, 1810s, 1820s, the slave trade was being made illegal, criminalized. Notice I say this trade itself. Now, for the most part, slavery as an institution was not outlawed in many places. In fact, in Brazil, as a Portuguese colony and so forth, it would go on until 1888, which is years, right? A couple of years after the Berlin Conference. So it wasn't, in the U.S. even, it wasn't, the civil wars in the 1860s and emancipation comes thereabouts. So slavery itself wasn't anything, but the slave trade, the bringing of enslaved people from Africa was being outlawed. And there's I've made another video that talked about that at length, but it came down to economic reasons, things that were changing economically, as well as the rise of the humanitarian voice of abolitionists and other things like that in the 19th century. So it was changing in that regard, right? The rise of the Enlightenment era as we went into the 19th century. So that was one. So there was that void in how Europe traded with Africa, and this is tied to the third point, which is not the third point, rather the seeking of legitimate commerce in Africa. Well, now that we can enslave, our business in Africa cannot be that of enslaving people anymore and giving them these piecemeal, crappy things such as alcohol and beads in return for capturing their people in this form of quote unquote trade. What legitimate commerce are we going to do in Africa now? So there's this void that Europeans are exploring at the time. Going along with the end of the slave trade is the Industrial Revolution. Remember that this is the era of the Industrial Revolution. It started in earnest in the 18th century, goes through the 19th century, and it blows up. So what does this mean? Well, because the Industrial Revolution is booming, Africa will serve two important means, purposes in the case of the Industrial Revolution, and that is to say, the first one is if you are producing a lot of things now, as manufacturing allows you, you're going to need a market. Now remember that and you can't just sell it to your neighbors, right? Why? Because they're also going through the Industrial Revolution. Britain can't do business explicitly with France and Germany, who are also going through the Industrial Revolution. They're about the same time. They can't just trade with the U.S., which is not only still growing as a nation throughout the 19th century, but is also going through its own Industrial Revolution, right? So where has the Industrial Revolution not happened en masse that you can sell them these things you're making? Well, Africa, for example, is one such place. Other places as well, such as Eastern Europe and much of Asia. But Africa, for sure, which is very close, if anything, it's tied at the hip to Europe geographically. And of course, they've been there during the slave trade, as well as in other parts of the Portuguese, on the Swahili coast with the Dutch, settled at the Cape Colony in what is modern day South Africa. So they are familiar with the place, right? So there is a large population in Africa that they can possibly sell these goods to that they have manufactured. That's the first reason. The second reason, and it really could be the first, right? What is it that Africa provides that is essential to the Industrial Revolution? Well, raw materials, right? You're gonna want to get copper in what is modern day Zambia. You're gonna want gold in the Gold Coast, in what is now Ghana. You're gonna want palm oil, which was critical in the 19th century as lubricant for machines and stuff, especially before the rise of the use of petroleum. So they want to get into Africa for all those raw materials, right? So they're seeking legitimate commerce. They're looking for a market. They're looking for raw materials. Okay. And there's also growing competition in the rivers. What is this competition? Not in just the rivers, but just growing competition of European powers, right? So we'll look at a few things here. So for example, consider this. Consider that alongside the south-facing part of West Africa, which is where Ghana and Nigeria are, the British had a monopoly over there. If anything, they'd even sent a naval squadron to help stifle the slave trade at the end of the 18th century. And now, in 1879, the French started to construct a railway from Dakar to link their colony of Senegal with the upper Niger Valley, right? And in so doing, the French government hoped to gain control of large parts of West Africa, right? And in 1882, France also occupies Tunisia and so forth. And all this begins to threaten British near monopoly on West Africa, on the south facing coastline that I described earlier. So already there's this British and French conflict happening there. Furthermore, Henry Morton Stanley, who's the Welsh American explorer, quote unquote, who had spent a lot of time in doing the bidding for King Leopold of the Congo, and we'll talk more about King Leopold in a little bit, had really pushed for King Leopold and King Leopold of Belgium, right? The second, he had these intentions of claiming what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but what became the Congo Free State for himself, not for Belgium, by the way, but for himself as his personal property. And in so doing, he had suggested to the French, remember there's this conflict, he had suggested to the French that if they did not support his claim for this, he would allow the British to establish a railway in the Congo, which he was already actively involved in, okay? And so doing guarantee that the British have control of Central Africa instead of the French. So, and the French, even though they were not scared of tiny Belgium per se, but that idea of the British getting involved in that territory really shook them, right? So they end up agreeing to respect King Leopold's claim to the Congo. This is all in the 1870s. if that would mean that they would shut, King Leopold would not allow the British to build in the Congo. And this is a direct quote from King Leopold II himself. Um, it is my judgment that we should not try to make a correction. It does not harm for Paris to fear that a British protectorate could be established in the Congo. And what he's saying to make a correction is to rectify that they've been lying about the British wanting to establish that protectorate. But it's like, what? Let that lie ride because it will benefit us and it doesn't hurt the French to be on their toes. In response to that, by the way, the British then supported Portuguese claims to Angola and the Congo Mouth, which is more in West Central Africa, right? So because the Congo now laid claim, Belgium now laid claim to what is the DRC, which is right in the center of Africa, but at the risk of expansion by Belgians or by the French, the British backed the Portuguese and all this. And Otto von Bismarck, who was the leader of Germany at the time, sensed that at this rate, you might end up with nothing, right? The French are in there with the British, the Belgians are involved, the Portuguese are involved. So in 1884, before the conference, he claimed German protectorates over Togo, Cameroon, and Southwest Africa, which is known as Namibia today. Then it was out of that he ended up inviting the major powers to negotiate the free, to negotiate other things, which we'll talk about shortly. So I just thought I would lay that out. I probably got a bit ahead of myself, but those are some of the things that were happening in Europe at the time. There's a particular interest in rivers, right? Since those are areas of navigation, and the rivers that were prominent include the Niger River, the Congo River, and of course the Nile. It was also known as, Africa is also known as the last terra incognita, which is the Latin term for the last known place, last place to be investigated. Now, as you very well know, the Europeans and others have been interacting with Africa for centuries, if not millennia. But the idea here is the interior of Africa, right? A lot of the interaction was with the coastal areas, ancient Mali, ancient Ghana, Cape Colony, the Swahili coast in East Africa, and so forth. But just places like the Congo, right? These central places, at least to the Europeans at the time, they were regarded as last terra incognita. And typically, when the Europeans went in, they were welcomed, and we'll talk a little more about that. And I've spoken about this in my other videos. But also, in addition to this, the scramble for Africa was also spurred by what is known as the white man's burden, and I'll talk a little more about that on my next slide. So how was the scramble able to be executed? Well, one of the things that the Europeans did after dissecting the continent was exploitation of existing rivalries, right? So the rivalries were usually much smaller, if you will, or much more benign than what became of what they became when put in through the lens of the Berlin Conference. Much like divisions had been exploited during the transatlantic slave trade to benefit the imperialists, the same thing would happen to the exploitation of existent rivalries in Africa. And I've got a great quote here from Namibia in 1890, when the Germans had moved on into Namibia, which was what would become Southwest Africa, and they were able to exploit the rivalry between the Nama people and the Herero people. So what they did was they offered the Herero a treaty of protection, and in return proposed to help them in the long-term territorial conflict with the Nama. Hendrik Witbooi, the Nama leader, knew what this meant, right? Knew the implications of the German threats very well. He wrote to my Herero, the Herero chief, warning him of the reality of this new alliance, and it reads, "You think you will retain your independent chieftainship after I have been destroyed? But my dear captain, You will eternally regret your action in having handed over to the white man the right to govern your country. After all, our war is not as serious as you think. But this thing you have done, to surrender yourself to the government of the white man, will be a burden that will carry on your shoulders, that you will carry on your shoulders. You call yourself supreme chief, but when you are under another's control, you are merely a subordinate chief. And I thought that was so powerful. End quote. Sorry. That when it said here, after all, our war is not as serious as you think. The idea is we have been fighting among ourselves as African groups, African states, African communities. It is nothing compared to what colonialism is about to bring upon us. And he was so prophetic in that because within 20 years, the Herero people themselves will be almost wiped out by the German settlers. And I think I've spoken about that in another video that I'll link in the description. So there's the exploitation of that. And the second thing was, of course, the military advantage, right? To which they had far superior guns. And even though many of the Africans had pretty sophisticated weaponry, and prior to the Scramble, they'd also been trading in various European guns. They were not no match for the European guns. So, for example, and in particular the Maxim gun, which transformed European military fortunes in Africa. Its use was often crucial in the final crushing of resistance. Outmoded European guns had for years been freely sold to Africans, but restrictions were placed upon the sale of latest models. So although most African armies of resistance had many breech-loading rifles, none acquired the Maxim gun. And there's a great couplet here from 1898 by the British anti-imperialist poet Hilaire Belloc, who summed up this dynamic when he said, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." And this is essentially what would shift that dynamic. So this is what Europe was like. This is what Europe was dealing with before going into Berlin. I mentioned the white man's burden earlier, and this is just the idea that based on values of enlightenment and the sort of nationalism that Europe had been going through in that period, and the heightened sense of Christianity and the call of what we call the Great Commission, right, which is go and make followers of Christ in all the lands. This idea put upon them this idea of what we call the white man's burden, where Europeans and the U.S. as part of the Western world felt that it was upon them, it was their divine right to go and civilize the rest of the world and Christianize the rest of the world. So not only was there this economic purpose, which I just explained in the Industrial Revolution, but the conference and the partitioning of Africa was sold to the masses in large part on the basis, or to the European masses on the basis of, you know what, this is what we've been sent to do. We must go and live these people out of their destitute poverty and their absence of civilization and so forth. We must show them the way in their pagan ways. And right, at the risk of being crashed, a lot of that was BS, right? And I'll touch on that a little bit later in the video, but also I think there's a lot of work that goes to show that, it is just a ridiculous premise. It was really just about imperialism and subjugation and for the gain of the Europeans. There was nothing in it for the Africans. And in fact, I've done another video which is titled "The Balance Sheet of Colonialism." I'll link it in the description, and I think it will help illuminate a lot of these things that I'm talking about. It will have that conversation in full. So the Berlin Conference, right? In many ways, different groups call for this, right? King Leopold, I've already explained prominently that he was trying to secure the King Leopold II was was the Belgian monarch, and he's a terrible, terrible man. I think I've spoken about him in depth in other videos, but he's a terrible, terrible man. There's a book written about him known as King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Horshaw that I think is a fantastic capturing of his brutalities. Um, and I can probably do another video just dedicated to him at some point. But just a very, very brutal man who is responsible for quite possibly 10 million deaths, which make him up there, put him right up there with the likes of Hitler in terms of body count, right? Um, but he was one person who was very invested in making sure that Africa was partitioned and in a bid to secure his own territory. You wanted um, the Congo, what became the Congo Free State, all to himself. Portugal was another one that was sort of struggling, felt that their positionality as well, some of the Europeans that had been in Africa before others, but now that the British and the French were staking their claims, the Germans, they wanted to make sure that they were okay as well. So they felt that if this was done properly. And so who calls for the meeting? Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, calls for this meeting in Berlin, 1884, 1885, right? It runs over that period. And there are 14 signatory nations that attend the conference. And these include among them some of the people we've already discussed, right? Which is to say Germany was there, of course, they were hosting the event. Belgium was there, it's King Leopold's land. The British and the French were there, the Portuguese were there, the Spanish were there. Let's say the French already, yep, indeed. The Dutch, Netherlands was there, but also Denmark was there. Sweden, Norway together as one entity, Sweden, Norway. Austria-Hungary also as one entity. The Ottoman Empire, of course, it was there, even though it was kind of coming to an end of its reign. Russia was also there and hanging out with the cool European kids as they tend to do. The US of A was also there, right? So these are the groups that were represented. And the large thing that came out of this was what is known as the General Act, and we'll look at some of the concessions of the General Act shortly. And as a result of that, even though there were very few places where Europeans had settled prior to the Berlin Conference, right? Like I said, there was the Dutch and British colonies on the Cape, the Cape in the Cape Colony in South Africa. You see the Portuguese sort of dabbling in settlement in East Africa at the time, but really nowhere. The people hadn't really been settled for a long time. The French were in West Africa in pockets and so forth. However, by 1900, just 15 years after the Berlin Conference, 90% of Africa was under European rule. And the parts of Africa that were largely untouched included places like Ethiopia, which was never colonized. And we'll talk a little more about that. I think I spoke about that in a video with their defeat of the Italians in the 1890s and so forth. Sierra Leone and Liberia, which were formed by freed British slaves and freed American slaves, respectively. These are some of the countries that were not colonized in that sense. So, but by 1900, 90% of the continent was partitioned, and this image here captures the process perfectly, with Africa being portrayed as a huge cake, and Otto von Bismarck is here, surrounded by other European heads of state who are getting a cut as well. Some of the other countries that were on that list, that were the signatories, didn't get any significant territory in the continent. Of course, the most were, the British got a lot, the French got a lot. King Leopold got his Congo. The Portuguese, the Germans, the Spanish had a little bit of territory as well. and so forth. But we'll look at some of those territories in a map shortly. Oh, there we go, right here. So just to show how quickly the takeover was, as I explained, where the Europeans were, you get, the French were in Algeria. So the French in Algeria, you see them in Senegal and in the Congo. Right now, this is a different. This is not King Leopold. This is not the Congo Free State. This is what we call the Republic of Congo today, as opposed to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is more here. Okay, then you have, of course, the Cape Colony where the British had settled, with the Orange Free State and South Africa Republic where the Dutch are. But for the most part, you can tell that these kingdoms and states are African states. You have Tippu running things in the middle of Central Africa here with the Kazembe state, which I'll talk about shortly as well. You have the Ethiopian Empire, which stood resolute, the Sokoto Caliphate, which was very powerful, the Ashanti Empire, which looks small here, but it was small but mighty, and so forth. The Tukolo, right? The Tukolo Empire is another one that is very, very powerful, out of which I believe Sekou Touré's grandfather fought, Sekou Touré being a revolutionary leader of Guinea. So this is what the map looked like, right? At the time in 1880. Then in 1930, it looked like this. And it might be hard to tell from there, but I'll go to some of the colors. So this is after it had been dissected. It looked very much like this in 1900, by the way, but 1913 is the date that this graphic gave me. So the pink part here is all the territories of the United Kingdom. So we are looking at modern day South Africa. We are looking at
Kenya, right? Over here. We are looking at much of the Sudan and other places all the way up here. Okay. And then we also have Nigeria prominently here, as well as Ghana over here, then Sierra Leone. So that's the British. Then this blue part here, the blue part here is the French. So you see them in Madagascar, you see them in Senegal, pretty much much of West Africa, including Algeria, Morocco, Mali, Senegal, Burkina Faso, the Guineas, and so forth, okay? Then you have Portugal as the green. So that's Angola mainly, as well as Mozambique, okay? Then Guinea-Bissau over here, and the islands, which are Cape Verde. Spain has the darker shade of yellow here, which is Western Sahara and Morocco area. Italy had tiny pockets in Libya, in Somalia, as well as in Eritrea. Then Germany had Namibia, what is Tanzania now, German East Africa at the time, Cameroon and Togo. Belgium, by 1913, it was now a Belgian colony, because in 1908 they took over from King Leopold after his atrocities had been put on full display, but it had been given to King Leopold. Then Liberia is an interesting case. Like I said, it was resettled by African American slaves. Then Ethiopia was never colonized, and that's a fascinating story. Like I said, I talk about it in my video that focuses on Africa and the Second World War, so you can engage with that one. Okay, cool. So what were some of the takeaways of the General Act of the Berlin Conference? Some of the takeaways of the General Act. One of the things that they decided on, and really this was used as impetus to go to the conference, was to end intra-continental slavery by different African and Islamic powers, right, or known as the East African slave trade. So this was something that was rampant at the time, with enslavers, with Swahili enslavers like Tipu Tip, which you saw in the other graphic, prominent for enslaving different groups in Central Africa and moving them to the east coast of Africa, and then being sold either to the islands, okay, to the islands, Mauritius, Madagascar, or Zanzibar, or even into the Middle East, into Western Asia, right? So this was used as pretext for this, so if, the conference was, it was sort of propaganda to frame it as a benevolent initiative for the Africans. So if we Europeans can get together and discuss this, we can bring an end to this form of slavery. We know it's BS for a few reasons, right? First of all, even though the transatlantic slave trade had ended maybe beginning, in the past 70 to 50 years, in many ways, the reason why there was even an increase in East African slave demands is because of the plantations set up by the French over the 19th century in places like Madagascar and Reunion, where a lot more Africans were being enslaved from the mainland and to work there. So it wasn't as if these places were entirely benevolent, right? We know that slavery in Portugal doesn't end, like I said earlier, until 1888, 3-4 years after the conference. So what are you talking about when you are getting together to end slavery in Africa? In the meantime, the biggest slave population in the Americas is still a thing, right? As under the under the control of the Portuguese. We also know that, for example, after the Europe, we also know that in South Africa, people are enslaved as well in South Africa, right? That's still a thing that's going on. That was going on at the time. We also know that once people like King Leopold settled on the continent, the conditions under which the people worked, particularly in collecting rubber, was not too far away. What was slavery? That's what it was. And in many ways, with all the tropes, with all the violence of it, right? There's a scene which I talk about in other videos. One of the practices that they had was people had to collect rubber. That was part of how the Africans were enslaved into collecting rubber, and if they didn't, the force Republic, which was the force, King Leopold's force, would go out and if you didn't have your buckets of rubber, you would get your hands chopped off, and the soldiers had to bring either 20 buckets, for example, more like 200 buckets of rubber, or 200 hands, to show that they'd cut off the hands of people who didn't provide enough rubber. So it was very brutal, and that's a lecture unto its own, really. So that was one. The Congo Free State, as I explained, was confirmed as private property of King Leopold II. There was also free access to the waterways. They were open to free trade, the likes of the Niger River, the Congo River, the Nyasa Basin, the Congo Basin, all these things. The Europeans were allowed to come in and do, the signatories were allowed to come in and use them freely for their trade purposes. Another thing that came into play was the principle of effectivity, which essentially, to put it colloquially, if you don't use it, you lose it. So if you got some land partitioned to you and it was seen after a while that you were not using it, it will be redistributed to somebody else. Then also, any fresh acting of taking possession of any portion of the African coast would have to be notified by the power taking possession or assuming a protectorate to the other signatory powers. What does that mean? Well, you can't just go in and claim land for yourself anymore, which was the big thing that the European nations had been worried about prior to prior to, it's one of the things that brought him to the table, right? This idea that anybody felt they could claim territory on the continent. And again, I must emphasize that in all these decisions are being made without any African input, right? No Africans were at the conference. 98, 99% of the continent had no idea the conference was happening in Germany to discuss what would essentially be their future going forward. So these are some of the concessions of the Berlin Conference. So I've spoken a lot about what brought Europe to the table. Now let's look a little bit about what was happening in Africa circa the Berlin Conference. And I've done other videos as well that lead up to this point. So this is not all I'm saying about Africa, but you can watch those other videos as well about Africa in the 18th century, 17th century, and so forth, that put some of these different places in context. So what are some of the important dynamics that they play? First off, I explained the East African slave trade already that was happening. It was not a noble enterprise, right? I don't want to sanitize or romanticize it. However, it is important to recognize that the East African slave trade was a far smaller, far less violent enterprise than the transatlantic slave trade had ever been. In fact, it went back for over 1,000 years, but it was dealing in small numbers. If anything, it didn't shoot up until the 18th century, and the reason it shot up was because of those French colonies that had been opened in Mauritius, Madagascar, and other islands, right? In the Indian Ocean. It is because as the Europeans tried to contain the monster they had created by shutting down the slave trade in West Africa, rogue elements were starting to capture people and moving them through the Indian Ocean up by way of the west side, up the Atlantic Ocean, to populate the colonies in places like in the Americas, in places like Brazil. So this is what led to a boom in the East African slave trade. Okay, so but that was definitely a thing. So that was going on. The other thing that was happening as well is the rise. There was I won't say the rise because the empires had always been there, but there were prominent empires. And I would say nascent statehood. And I say nascent not to be condescending or to be patronizing, but I'm saying because as we understand states now, right, as we understand states in the world system today, we were seeing a lot of those that looked just like that in Africa at the time, right? So if you look at what the Ashanti Empire was becoming, complete with the ideas of this, that became this flag a little bit later on. If you look at places like, of course, we've already spoken about Sierra Leone and Liberia, although struggling through it, but they were there. If you look at places like Nigeria and some of the enterprise that they had at the time, those are states. But we can also look at the empires, right? We can talk about the Zulu nation in Africa, prominent in the 1820s and going forward under the leadership of Shaka and eventually Dingane, which was a very nuanced civilization. We spoke about the Tukolo and the Sokoto Caliphate. We spoke about the Ethiopian Empire, right? So these were the idea of the Berlin Conference being put in place on an empty blank slate of Africa is wrong. And let me just say this. It doesn't matter at all if nothing had been happening on the continent. Colonialism was a vile enterprise and should not have happened anyway. However, and it doesn't matter if everybody was just sort of doing their own thing or if we were like living in these little pockets here and there. However, I also emphasize that there were actually these very real nations and empires that were there. The Zulus. We can talk about the Rosary Empire in modern day Zimbabwe. We can talk about the Kololo people. The Lozi Empire in modern day Zambia, Barotsa land, and these sort of communities, right? These were all there already. Also, what is critical was Africa across the board was entering an era of post-slavery peace. Now, this is not to say that things like the East African slave trade were not happening, but the transatlantic slave trade had initiated an era of hyper-violence, especially towards the end, because what it did was not only did it introduce a lot of guns into the context, it was also predicated on different African groups capturing other people and selling them off into enslavement. So initially that may have been the violence, it was very violent from the beginning, but that violence would increase more and more as one, the place got depopulated and you needed to go more inland to capture more people. And also the people you were trying to capture had heard about this and were well prepared, probably with some guns themselves. So the wars were getting more and more violent. And of course, groups had, even if you wanted to trade in other things, groups had destroyed so much trade in each other that there was no trade in anything else, right? It was just people were just capturing people, selling them to the Europeans, then getting, again, little trinkets like cloth and alcohol from the Europeans. However, as the transatlantic slave trade started to end, the value of capturing people and selling them off into enslavement across the board was decreasing so much that we saw a resurgence in other forms of trade, in natural resource trade. People started trading again in palm oil, right? People started trading in gold and ivory. Again, you start to see more of these things happening across. So there's this, and also if you're going to be trading with people in that way, it serves you well to be at peace with them, right? It's not just a good thing to do on some benevolent trip. It's also just a better thing to, it allows groups to be more productive in hunting for things or growing things. And they can, if you trade with them and trust is at an elevated level, you can trade more. So there was this era of post-slavery trade, which was accompanied by a growth in the natural resource trade. And as a result of this natural resource trade, there were also very nuanced trade routes, transcontinental trade routes that are incredible to follow right now. And if you go back, let me go back to a map I showed earlier here and show you so some of the prominent things. So an important trade that was happening would be oftentimes gold would come from West Africa, right? Maybe from around here, and be moved by the Kazembe people or the Lao people, or Tipu Tip from around here, right? And moved all the way to the East Coast, maybe by way of Zanzibar, and then it goes to the Middle East, or what we call Western Asia, that way. So you have this sort of trade, very nuanced trade routes that were developing, and oftentimes you would get ivory, maybe from further down here, right? And it'd be sold to different groups up here as well. So very intricate trade routes that were existent. And I say all this to say that Africa might have been terra incognita to the Europeans, but it was very, very nuanced by the time that the Europeans got there, so this is very important. So what happens after the continent is partitioned? Well, essentially, as the European nations take control and claim different territories, there are four main systems of colonial rule that are established. The first one is what we call economic companies, and the name is exactly as it suggests. This would be the government of a European nation getting behind a company, putting out these charters, and companies would apply or would ask for the government's backing to occupy certain places. So these companies included the British South African Company, which was Cecil John Rhodes's company, and their flag is up here. That settled in South Africa and what was Rhodesia. This is to say Zimbabwe now, and Northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia now. Okay, you get countries like the Dutch. The British East African Company settled in places like Kenya. You get the Sierra Leone Company. Now, this was even before, of course, the partitioning of Africa. But the Sierra Leone was actually another British company as well that was responsible for settling and what eventually gave the country that name, Sierra Leone. So that's one way. Another prominent way was direct rule, and this was common among the French, the Belgians, the Portuguese, and the Germans. And the idea here was to disrupt locally existing structures of governance of the indigenous people and try to mold the government of the place in the way of the European nation, almost to create little France or little Belgium or whatever within these territories, right? So in a way, these countries like Senegal and so forth became sort of provinces of the French Empire, and people were really pushed to, the African people who were colonized were really put in positions to, quote unquote, evolve into being more European-esque. So if you look in the French and the Belgian territories, there's this concept of the évolué, which is the French word for the evolved. So the Africans who were more educated along Western lines and spoke great French and carried themselves a certain way were known as the évolué, which meant the evolved ones. Like the rest of the Africans are uncivilized, right? But the closer you get to this, you are regarded as the évolué. The same thing can be said for the concept of the assimilados in the Portuguese colonies, where certain people were regarded as the ones who assimilated, right? So that's big. And to this day, one of the ways that shows is, I'm from a former British colony myself, and our English is largely pretty good, as a result of the colonial. It's nothing to brag about. It just is as you lived in that education system. However, I've noticed, and this is not scientific, by the way, so if anybody's watching this and can check me in the comments, I would appreciate that. But one of the things that I've noticed with like my French or Portuguese, my Africans from those former colonies, every one of them, to the man, is natively fluent in the language of the colony. If they're from Mozambique or Angola, their Portuguese is flawless, right? The same thing I can say for people from the Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal. Their French is flawless, and it doesn't matter which part of the country they came from. They came from the rural areas or from the cities, in ways that I don't think a lot of Anglophone English is the same. Of course, a lot of Anglophone Africans are very, very good at English, but you can also find somebody who really struggles with it. Whereas to me, even though I can't speak the language, it almost always seems that they're speaking with a native proficiency. And I'm apt to suspect that is a direct of this direct rule system. But if anybody knows more about that, let me know in the comments. Indirect rule is something that was more synonymous with the British, where, and this maybe accounts for that disconnect I'm talking about, in which the British sort of tried to preserve traditional systems of rule while they administrated from the top. So you might still have your chief in place, your traditional chief, but of course a lot of these times these were co-opted, maybe even replaced by chiefs who were more partial to the British or were more subservient. But in a way, they tried to use these structures that were familiar to the different. So this was popular in Nigeria, popular in Ghana, in these colonies, right, where they have you might still have your local chief, but he's a pale shadow of the powers that he used to be, because they have to act in accordance with the might of the British. So that's more indirect rule. Then settler rule was where the European groups came in their hundreds of thousands and in some places millions to settle in the African country and create a sort of republic for themselves, in which typically the African groups were not citizens of their own land. So South Africa is a perfect example of that, where millions of South Africans settled in South Africa. And in 1910 in particular, the British and the Dutch descendants who had been at war with each other came together to create what they call the Union of South Africa, except that only they were the citizens of it, and the millions and millions of Africans, of Bantu and Khoisan people who had been there for hundreds of years, if not thousands in the case of the Khoisan, were not regarded as citizens of this state. Same thing happens with the Rhodesians in Zimbabwe, where hundreds and thousands of them settle in Zimbabwe. Same thing happens in Kenya with the British still. Then with the French in Algeria, for example, where by the time of the Algerian Revolution in the 50s, there were 3 million French people who were settled in France. So those are the 4 main types of colonial rule: indirect rule, direct rule, settler rule, and economic companies. And just to show the endurance of the colonial. So this is what colonialism looked like in 1945, okay? This is how the country had been partitioned. At peak colonialism, at the end of the Second World War, before the beginning of what we call the African nationalist era, this is what the continent looked like. And this is what it looks like today. So what do you see when you compare these two? Well, the big thing you may notice is that there's a couple more countries in this one, right? For example, South Sudan splitting with South Sudan splitting with North Sudan. I mean, South Sudan splitting from Sudan, if you will, over here, and so forth. But for the most part, it looks the same, right? So this is another enduring legacy of colonialism, that the partitioning of the continent today continues to be problematic in so many ways. Problematic is, and just to put it slightly, and sometimes it causes full-out wars. And this is some of the things that the song in the beginning was talking about in Zimbabwe, with some of the contrived disconnect between the population we call the Shona people and then Ndebele people, which again are also even colonial identities, right? But that conflict stems from, in large part, how some of these borders were drawn. And like I said, I get more into detail about that in my video titled Balance Sheet of Colonialism. So, but I just thought this was interesting to show just how the partitioning of the continent by the European powers, who had no other purpose but to serve themselves, still endures today, even 60 years plus in some places of independence. So that's it for this video. What are some of the key takeaways here? What are some of the key dynamics in Africa at the eve of the scramble for Africa? What is Africa like on the eve of the scramble for Africa? What European dynamics led to the scramble? What was happening in Europe at the time that necessitated this, quote unquote, for them? The Berlin Conference. When does it happen? Who was there? And what important roles did different people play? What were some of the key concessions of the General Act of the Berlin Conference? And what are the 4 types of colonial rule? Right. So revisit that, and and I'm glad to have had you here with me. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to the channel, share it with somebody who will share it with somebody, and so we can grow this work. Much appreciated. And like I said at the beginning, this is part of that Intro to African History series. So take it as that. And if you want to engage with some of this material more, I'll leave some of my sources in the description, and you can also just research it yourself. But this is just to introduce you to it. It's part of a series. I have other videos that on this channel that are not a part of that series that get more in depth in different things. You can watch the recent one I did on titled To Pay or Not to Pay, which was an in-depth look into the Zimbabwean land redistribution program. So you can look at that as well. And also finally, still prayers and voices up for Nigeria, #EndSARS, and rest in peace to the Luveve boy, the spitter, Calvin, who passed away yesterday, Zimbabwean rapper. And with that in mind, I am done with you today. I look forward to seeing you next time. One.